Chapter 1. The desert holds its secrets. The New Mexico desert stretches endlessly in all directions, dry, silent, and humming with mystery. In July of 1947, this vast expanse of sand and sagebrush would become the epicenter of America's greatest unexplained event. But tonight, as we drift through this story together, we'll explore it gently, like watching distant lights dance across the horizon. Picture the desert in summer. The heat shimmers off the ground in waves, creating mirages that dance and disappear. Cacti stand like ancient sentinels, their shadows growing long as the sun begins its descent. The air smells of creosote and dust, that distinctive scent of the American Southwest that gets into your soul and never leaves. It was here, in this seemingly empty landscape, that rancher Mac Brazel would make a discovery that would change everything. But let's not rush to that moment. Let's float above it all first, like a gentle breeze carrying us over the vastness. Mac Brazel was a simple man. Weathered by years under the desert sun, his hands told the story of a life spent working the land. He owned a ranch about 75 miles northwest of Roswell, a spread of scrubland where he ran sheep and cattle. Not the kind of place you'd expect to find anything unusual, just endless sky and endless earth meeting at the horizon. The summer of 1947 had been different, though. Thunderstorms had been rolling through the area more frequently than usual, great towering clouds that built up in the afternoon heat and unleashed their fury in brief, violent displays. Lightning would crack across the sky like nature's own fireworks show, illuminating the desert in stark, white flashes before disappearing back into darkness. On the night of July 2nd, one such storm had passed through Brazel's ranch. He'd watched it from his modest ranch house, the way people do in the desert, with a mixture of hope and concern. Rain was always welcome in this dry land, but the storms could be dangerous. Lightning could start fires. Hail could kill livestock. But this storm felt different somehow. Neighbors would later say they heard something unusual that night. Not just the familiar rumble of thunder, but something else. A sound that didn't quite fit. Like the desert itself was trying to tell them something. When morning came, the air was clean and fresh, washed by the rain. The desert had that particular smell it gets after a storm, ozone and wet earth mixing with the sage. Mac Brazel stepped out onto his porch and breathed it in, the way he'd done thousands of mornings before. But today would not be like those other mornings. As he made his rounds, checking on his animals and surveying any damage from the storm, Brazel came across something that shouldn't have been there. Scattered across a stretch of his property, maybe 3/4 of a mile long and a few 100 feet wide, was debris. Lots of debris. At first glance, it might have looked like the remnants of some kind of aircraft. In 1947, experimental flights were common in this part of New Mexico. The military was testing all sorts of new technology, pushing the boundaries of what was possible in the sky. So finding pieces of something that had crashed wouldn't necessarily be shocking. But this was different. The material was unlike anything Brazel had ever seen. Some of it looked metallic, but felt lighter than aluminum. It had a strange quality to it, almost like it was both solid and not solid at the same time. When he tried to cut it with his knife, the blade wouldn't penetrate. When he tried to burn it with a match, it wouldn't catch fire. There were beams of some kind, too. They looked like wood, but they weren't wood. They were incredibly light, yet incredibly strong. Along their length ran symbols, markings that looked almost like hieroglyphics, but not quite. They seemed to shimmer in the sunlight, changing color slightly as the light hit them from different angles. And there was foil. Lots of foil-like material. But this wasn't ordinary foil. When Brazel crumpled it up in his hand, it would smooth itself back out, returning to its original shape, without any wrinkles or creases. It was as if the material remembered what it was supposed to look like. For several days, Brazel left the debris where it lay. He was a practical man, not given to flights of fancy. Whatever this stuff was, it was probably just some new military experiment that had gone wrong. The government was always testing something out here in the desert. Better to mind his own business. But curiosity is a powerful thing. And as the days passed, that curiosity grew stronger. The material continued to fascinate him. The way it behaved defied everything he thought he knew about how things were supposed to work. Finally, on July 6th, Brazel made a decision. He loaded up his truck with some of the larger pieces of debris and drove into Roswell. He'd heard stories about flying saucers in the newspapers recently. People all over the country were reporting strange objects in the sky. Maybe someone at the sheriff's office would know what to make of his discovery. Sheriff George Wilcox listened to Brazel's story with the patient attention of a man who'd heard all kinds of strange tales in his years of law enforcement. But when he saw the material that Brazel had brought with him, his demeanor changed. This wasn't the usual sort of odd thing that people brought to his office. The sheriff made a phone call to Roswell Army Airfield. If this was military equipment, they'd want to know about it. And if it wasn't, well, they'd want to know about that too. Major Jesse Marcel, the intelligence officer at the base, took the call. Within hours, he was at the sheriff's office, examining the debris that Brazel had collected. Marcel was an experienced officer, trained to identify aircraft and equipment. He'd seen just about every type of military hardware that existed, but he'd never seen anything like this. As the sun set over Roswell that evening, painting the desert sky in shades of orange and purple, a chain of events was set in motion that would echo through the decades. The military would arrive at the ranch, debris would be collected, witnesses would be questioned, and then, just as quickly as it had all begun, it would be covered up. But tonight, as we float gently above it all, we can see the bigger picture. We can see the desert holding its secrets, the way it had for thousands of years before that summer night in 1947, the way it continues to hold them still. The stars were coming out now, countless points of light in the clear desert sky. In a place like this, with no city lights to dim their brilliance, the universe reveals itself in all its infinite mystery. It's easy to understand, under a sky like that, how people might believe that we're not alone. And maybe, just maybe, on that night in July 1947, we weren't. Chapter 2. When the military arrived. The morning of July 7th dawned clear and bright over the New Mexico desert. Mac Brazel woke up to find his world about to change forever. By the time the sun was fully up, military vehicles were making their way across the dusty roads toward his ranch, kicking up plumes of sand that hung in the still air like ghostly fingers. Major Jesse Marcel led the convoy. He was a man who'd seen action in World War II, someone who understood the weight of responsibility. But as his jeep bounced along the rough ranch road, Marcel couldn't shake the feeling that he was about to encounter something completely outside his experience. The debris field was even more extensive than Brazel had described. It stretched across the landscape like the scattered remains of something that had fallen from a great height. Marcel stepped out of his vehicle and walked slowly among the pieces, his trained eye taking in every detail. This wasn't any aircraft he recognized. The material was extraordinary. Marcel picked up a piece of the metallic substance and turned it over in his hands. It was lighter than aluminum, but seemed incredibly strong. When he tried to bend it, it wouldn't yield. When he released the pressure, it snapped back to its original shape with a soft musical sound that seemed to hang in the desert air. He called to Sergeant Bill Rickett, one of the men who'd accompanied him to the site. Together they examined the strange beams. The symbols along their length were unlike anything in any earthly language. They seemed to shift and change as the two men looked at them, sometimes appearing raised, sometimes appearing etched, as if the marks were somehow alive. The foil material was perhaps the most puzzling of all. Marcel took a large sheet of it and crumpled it into a ball, then released it. The material unfolded itself, smoothing out every wrinkle until it lay flat and perfect, as if it had never been disturbed. He tried the experiment again and again, with the same result each time. How does metal remember its shape, he wondered. For hours, the team collected debris. Piece after piece was carefully gathered and loaded into the military trucks. Marcel made notes, trying to catalog everything they found, but the task seemed almost impossible. How do you describe something that defies description? As the afternoon wore on, more personnel arrived at the site. Intelligence officers, photographers, specialists of various kinds. The ranch that had been so quiet and isolated for so many years was suddenly bustling with activity. But there was something else happening too. A sense of urgency that went beyond simple military efficiency. Phone calls were being made, orders were being given. And slowly, a curtain of secrecy was beginning to descend over the entire operation. Marcel noticed the change in atmosphere. The casual conversation between the soldiers stopped. The easy camaraderie that had marked the morning's work gave way to something more serious, more guarded. Someone, somewhere, had made a decision about how this incident would be handled. By late afternoon, most of the larger pieces of debris had been collected. The military trucks were loaded with material that would soon disappear into classified storage facilities, never to be seen by civilian eyes again. But Marcel couldn't resist taking one more look at the crash site. Standing there in the growing shadows of evening, he tried to imagine what had happened. The debris pattern suggested something large had broken up in the air, scattering its contents across the desert floor. But what kind of aircraft could have produced debris like this? The answer, he was beginning to suspect, might be no aircraft at all. At least, no aircraft built by human hands. As darkness fell, Marcel made his way back to Roswell Army Airfield. The base was buzzing with activity. Personnel who normally worked regular hours were staying late. Phone lines were busy with calls to Washington. Something big was happening and everyone could feel it. Marcel was ordered to report directly to Colonel William Blanchard, the base commander. Blanchard was a no-nonsense officer, the kind of man who'd risen through the ranks by making quick, decisive judgments. But when Marcel walked into his office carrying a box of the strange material, even Blanchard seemed taken aback. The colonel examined the debris in silence. He bent the metal pieces, trying to break them. He studied the symbols on the beam fragments, running his fingers along their surface. And like Marcel, he found himself at a loss for words. "This changes everything," Blanchard finally said. The two men discussed options. Protocol demanded that they report their findings up the chain of command. But what exactly were they reporting? That they'd recovered debris from an unknown aircraft? That they'd found materials that seemed to defy the laws of physics? In the end, they decided to be cautious. The official report would describe the recovery of debris from an experimental military device, nothing more. The unusual properties of the materials would be noted in classified addenda, seen only by personnel with the highest security clearances. But even as they made these decisions, both men knew they were witnessing something historic. The desert had given up one of its secrets, and that secret was more profound than anything they'd imagined. Late that night, Marcel drove home through the quiet streets of Roswell. The town was asleep, unaware that just a few miles away, their reality had shifted in ways they couldn't yet comprehend. The stars overhead seemed brighter somehow, more present. The vast expanse of space that surrounded their small planet suddenly felt less empty. At home, Marcel's family was waiting up for him. His wife had kept dinner warm, and his young son was eager to hear about his father's day. Marcel looked at the boy, innocent and curious, and wondered what kind of world he would grow up in. A world where humans were alone in the universe, or something else entirely. Unable to resist, Marcel had brought a few small pieces of the debris home with him. Nothing classified, just some of the metallic fragments that seemed so impossible. He showed them to his family, watching their faces as they experienced the same wonder and confusion that he'd felt earlier in the day. His son held a piece of the memory metal, fascinated by the way it returned to its original shape no matter how he twisted it. In the soft light of the family's living room, the material seemed almost magical, like something from a fairy tale rather than a crash site. But this was no fairy tale. This was real. And tomorrow the machinery of secrecy would begin in earnest, ensuring that what they'd discovered in the desert would remain hidden from the world. For now, though, in the quiet of his home, Marcel allowed himself to marvel at the impossible. Somewhere out there in the darkness, among the countless stars, were beings capable of creating materials that earthly science couldn't explain. And for one brief moment in the summer of 1947, their paths had crossed with ours. The desert wind whispered through the sagebrush outside, carrying with it the ancient stories of the land. Stories of visitors from distant places, of lights in the sky, of mysteries that lay just beyond human understanding. Tonight, one more story had been added to that collection. A story that would endure, no matter how hard some people might try to bury it. Chapter 3. the day the truth almost slipped out. July 8, 1947 started like any other summer morning in Roswell, but by noon it would become one of the most famous days in the town's history. The desert sun was already climbing high, promising another scorching day, when Lieutenant Walter Haut sat down at his typewriter in the Public Information Office at Roswell Army Airfield. Haut was good at his job. He'd crafted countless press releases during his time at the base, usually about routine training exercises or personnel changes. Nothing too exciting, just the steady stream of information that kept the local newspapers happy and the public informed about their military neighbors. But today was different. Today, he had direct orders from Colonel Blanchard himself. The press release he was about to write would send shockwaves around the world. It would launch 1,000 investigations, inspire countless books and movies, and create a mystery that would endure for decades. And Walter Haut had no idea. He rolled a fresh sheet of paper into his typewriter and began to type. The many rumors regarding the flying disc became a reality yesterday, when the intelligence office of the 509th Bomb Group of the 8th Air Force, Roswell Army Airfield, was fortunate enough to gain possession of a disc through the cooperation of one of the local ranchers and the sheriff's office of Chavis County. Haut paused. A flying disc. Those were the exact words Colonel Blanchard had used. Not aircraft debris, not weather balloon fragments. A flying disc. He continued typing. The flying object landed on a ranch near Roswell sometime last week. Not having phone facilities, the rancher stored the disc until such time as he was able to contact the sheriff's office, who in turn notified Major Jesse Marcel of the 509th Bomb Group Intelligence Office. Action was immediately taken and the disc was picked up at the rancher's home. It was inspected at the Roswell Army Airfield and subsequently loaned by Major Marcel to higher headquarters. There it was. Simple, straightforward, matter of fact. The military had recovered a flying disc. They were treating it as significant enough to send to higher headquarters, and they wanted the public to know about it. Haut finished the release and made copies. He walked them personally to the 2 local radio stations, KGFL and KSWS, and to the Roswell Daily Record newspaper. By the time he returned to the base, the story was already spreading across the airwaves. Frank Joyce, a reporter at KGFL, couldn't believe what he was reading. A flying disc? He called Haut immediately, wanting to confirm that this wasn't some kind of joke. Haut assured him it was official. The military had recovered a flying disc, and they were announcing it to the world. Within hours, the story had jumped from local radio to the Associated Press wire service. Newspapers across the country were preparing headlines that would capture the imagination of millions. RAF captures flying saucer on ranch in Roswell region. But something was happening behind the scenes. Phone lines at Roswell Army Airfield were lighting up with calls from Washington. High-ranking officials who rarely concerned themselves with the day-to-day operations of a base in New Mexico were suddenly very interested in what was happening there. General Roger Ramey, commanding officer of the 8th Air Force, was one of those callers. He spoke directly with Colonel Blanchard, and their conversation was brief and decisive. Whatever had been found in the desert, the public didn't need to know the truth about it. By late afternoon, a new narrative was being constructed. The flying disc, officials now said, was actually debris from a high-altitude surveillance balloon, a classified project called Project Mogul, designed to monitor Soviet nuclear tests. The unusual materials that had so puzzled Major Marcel and his team were simply the remnants of experimental radar reflectors and weather instruments. It was a plausible explanation. The military was indeed conducting balloon experiments in the area, and in the tense early days of the Cold War, it made sense that such operations would be classified. People could understand the need for secrecy when it came to monitoring the Russians. But was it true? Major Marcel found himself at the center of the new story. He was ordered to pose for photographs with the balloon debris, holding pieces of rubber and tinfoil while reporters snapped pictures. The official narrative was simple. Marcel had mistakenly identified ordinary balloon materials as something more exotic. Marcel played his part, but those who knew him could see the discomfort in his eyes. This was a man who'd spent years identifying aircraft and military equipment. The idea that he could mistake weather balloon debris for something extraordinary seemed, to put it mildly, unlikely. The press bought the story, though. or at least they reported it faithfully. By the evening of July 8th, newspapers that had been preparing sensational headlines about recovered flying saucers were instead running modest stories about military weather balloons. Crisis averted. Public panic avoided. The truth safely buried. But truth has a way of persisting, even when it's inconvenient. Mac Brazel, the rancher who'd started it all, found himself detained by the military for several days. When he was finally released, he told a different story than the one he'd initially shared. The debris, he now said, was just the remains of a weather balloon. Nothing unusual about it at all. Those who knew Brazel could hear the reluctance in his voice. This was a man who'd lived his entire life on his own terms, beholden to no one. The idea that he would suddenly change his story, especially under pressure from the military, didn't sit well with his friends and neighbors. And there were other inconsistencies. If the debris was really from a weather balloon, why had it taken so many military personnel so many hours to collect it? Why the photography restrictions? Why the sudden security measures? Most puzzling of all, why had Colonel Blanchard authorized the original press release in the first place? This wasn't some junior officer making a mistake. This was a base commander, a man who'd flown bombing missions over Germany, someone who didn't make casual errors about important matters. As night fell on July 8th, Roswell found itself at the center of a mystery that would only deepen with time. The official story was clear and simple. Weather balloon debris, nothing more. But the unofficial story, whispered in coffee shops and bars, was far more intriguing. The desert had given up something extraordinary. The military had recovered it, briefly acknowledged it, then covered it up. And somewhere, in classified storage facilities far from New Mexico, the truth was waiting. For most Americans, the incident would fade from memory within days. Other news would capture their attention. Other concerns would occupy their thoughts. But for a few persistent investigators, July 8, 1947 would mark the beginning of a lifelong quest for answers. They would interview witnesses, dig through military records, and piece together evidence that the official story couldn't explain away. They would face ridicule and dismissal, but they would persist. Because sometimes, the most important truths are the ones that powerful people want to keep hidden. And sometimes those truths have a way of surviving, no matter how deeply they're buried. The stars over Roswell that night looked the same as they always had, infinite and mysterious. But for those who'd witnessed the events of the past few days, the universe had changed. It had become a place where impossible things were possible, where the boundaries of reality were more fluid than anyone had imagined. Tomorrow would bring new attempts to explain away what couldn't be explained. But tonight, under the vast New Mexico sky, the truth hung in the air like a promise waiting to be fulfilled. Chapter 4. Witnesses in the Shadows. The official story was out. Weather balloon debris, case closed. But in the days and weeks that followed that famous press release, something interesting began to happen in and around Roswell. People started talking. Quietly at first, in whispered conversations over coffee or during chance meetings on dusty street corners. They had seen things too. Glenn Dennis worked at the Ballard Funeral Home in Roswell. On July 7th, the day before the press release that would shake the world, Dennis received an unusual phone call from someone at the Army airfield. The caller wanted to know about the availability of small coffins, child-sized caskets. How quickly could they be delivered? And did the funeral home have any experience with bodies that had been damaged by exposure to the elements? Strange questions, but Dennis was a professional. He explained that yes, they could provide small caskets, and yes, they had experience with difficult cases. The caller thanked him and hung up without placing an order. Later that same day, Dennis had occasion to drive out to the base. He was delivering supplies for a routine funeral service, nothing connected to the mysterious phone call. But as he approached the base hospital, he noticed unusual activity. Military ambulances were parked near the loading dock. Personnel in protective gear were moving in and out of the building. Dennis parked his hearse and walked toward the building, curious about what was happening. Before he could get very close, he was approached by military police officers who ordered him to leave immediately. Their manner was brusque, almost hostile. This wasn't the usual friendly interaction between the base and local businesses. As Dennis was escorted back to his vehicle, he caught a glimpse of something being loaded into one of the ambulances. It was covered by a tarp, but the shape underneath was small, roughly the size of a child, or something child-sized. The mortician drove home with more questions than answers. The phone call about small coffins, the unusual security, the covered shapes being moved under military guard. None of it made sense in the context of a weather balloon recovery. But Dennis wasn't the only civilian who'd noticed strange activities at the base. Frankie Rowe was 12 years old in the summer of 1947. Her father was a firefighter in Roswell, and on July 5th, he'd been called out to assist with what officials described as a plane crash north of town. When he returned home that evening, he was unusually quiet. Finally, after much prodding from his curious daughter, he told her a little about what he'd seen. It hadn't been an ordinary plane crash. The wreckage was unlike anything he'd encountered in years of emergency response work, and there had been bodies at the crash site. Small bodies, not quite human. He made Frankie promise never to repeat what he'd told her. Not to her friends, not to her teachers, not to anyone. He seemed genuinely frightened by what he'd witnessed, and his fear was contagious. Years later, as an adult, Frankie would remember that conversation with perfect clarity. The way her father's hands had trembled slightly as he spoke. The distant look in his eyes, as if he was seeing something that challenged everything he thought he knew about the world. But in the summer of 1947, she was just a kid. And kids have a way of keeping secrets when the adults in their lives ask them to. Jim Ragsdale was camping in the desert with his girlfriend on the night of July 2nd. They'd driven out into the wilderness southwest of Roswell, looking for a quiet place to spend a romantic evening under the stars. What they found instead was something that would haunt Ragsdale for the rest of his life. Around midnight, they saw a bright flash of light streak across the sky. It wasn't like a meteor or a shooting star. This light pulsed and changed colors as it moved, eventually disappearing behind a ridgeline to the north. A few seconds later, they heard a distant crash, like thunder, but somehow different. Curiosity got the better of them. The next morning, Ragsdale and his girlfriend hiked toward the area where they'd seen the light disappear. What they found was a scar across the landscape, as if something large and heavy had plowed through the desert scrub before coming to rest against a rocky outcrop. And there was debris. Lots of debris. Some of it looked metallic, but it was unlike any metal Ragsdale had ever seen. It was incredibly light, almost like foil but impossibly strong. When he tried to tear a piece, it wouldn't give. When he crumpled it up, it smoothed itself back out. More disturbing were the other things they found. Small figures, obviously not human, scattered around what appeared to be the main body of whatever had crashed. Ragsdale was a tough man, a veteran who'd seen combat in World War II, but these beings unsettled him in ways he couldn't explain. He and his girlfriend didn't stay long. Something about the scene felt wrong, dangerous even. They gathered a few small pieces of the strange debris as evidence and hurried back to their car. By the time they returned the next day with a camera, military personnel had cordoned off the entire area. Signs warned of radiation danger. Armed guards made it clear that civilians were not welcome. Ragsdale never spoke publicly about what he'd seen until decades later, when investigators tracking down Roswell witnesses finally found him. Even then, he was reluctant to share details. Some memories, he said, were better left buried. But not everyone who witnessed unusual events that week chose to remain silent. Barbara Duggar worked at the Chavez County Sheriff's Office in 1947. Her grandfather was Sheriff George Wilcox, the man who'd first taken Mac Brazel's report about the strange debris on his ranch. Through her grandfather, Duggar had a front-row seat to the early stages of the Roswell incident. She remembered the day Brazel came into the office with pieces of the mysterious material. Sheriff Wilcox had called the whole staff over to look at it. None of them could identify what it was or where it might have come from. The metal was impossibly light and strong. The symbols on the beam fragments looked like nothing any of them had seen before. But what Duggar remembered most clearly was what happened after the military arrived. Sheriff Wilcox, normally a confident and outspoken man, became withdrawn and nervous. He stopped talking about the incident entirely, even with his own family. Years later, on his deathbed, Sheriff Wilcox would finally speak to his granddaughter about what he'd witnessed. The military, he told her, hadn't just taken the debris. They'd made it very clear that anyone who spoke about the incident would face serious consequences. The phrase he used was national security threat. A rancher bringing in strange debris had somehow become a matter of national security. The implications of that transformation would resonate for decades. As the summer of 1947 progressed, these witnesses and many others found themselves bound together by shared knowledge of something extraordinary. They'd seen evidence that the official weather balloon explanation couldn't adequately address, but they'd also learned that speaking publicly about their experiences came with risks. Some, like Mac Brazel, were reportedly threatened directly. Others faced more subtle forms of pressure. Military contracts were canceled. Business relationships were severed. The message was clear. Cooperation with the official narrative was expected, but secrets have a way of surviving, even under the most intense pressure. Witnesses might not speak publicly, but they remembered. They passed their stories down to children and grandchildren. They kept pieces of evidence hidden away in attics and basements. And slowly, over the years, those stories began to find their way to researchers who were willing to listen. Investigators who understood that sometimes the most important truths are the ones that powerful institutions work hardest to suppress. The desert wind that night whispered through the sagebrush and tumbleweeds, carrying with it the voices of those who'd seen too much. Their stories would endure, passed from generation to generation, waiting for a time when the world might be ready to hear them. Under the vast New Mexico sky, with its endless canopy of stars, the truth waited patiently for its moment to emerge from the shadows. Chapter 5. The Man Who Knew Too Much. Major Jesse Marcel never intended to become the face of the Roswell incident. He was a career military officer, trained to follow orders and maintain operational security. But fate had placed him at the center of one of the most controversial events in American history, and for the rest of his life, he would struggle with the weight of what he had witnessed. In the weeks following the recovery operation, Marcel tried to return to his normal duties. He filed his reports, attended his briefings, and carried out his responsibilities as the intelligence officer for the 509th Bomb Group. But he was a changed man. The debris he had examined, the materials that defied every known principle of earthly engineering, had opened his mind to possibilities he had never considered. Late at night, alone in his office, Marcel would find himself staring out at the desert sky. The stars that had once seemed distant and irrelevant now felt charged with meaning. Somewhere out there, beyond the reach of human technology, were beings capable of creating materials that Earth's greatest scientists couldn't duplicate or even understand. The official story about weather balloons never sat well with Marcel. He had been examining military equipment for years. He knew the difference between experimental radar reflectors and something truly unknown. The materials he had handled at the crash site were in a category all their own. But Marcel was also a practical man. He understood the realities of military service. Orders were orders, whether you agreed with them or not. If his superiors wanted the incident classified and forgotten, then that was how it would be handled, at least officially. Privately, Marcel began his own quiet investigation. He reached out to contacts in the scientific community, asking carefully worded questions about advanced materials research. Could any laboratory on Earth produce metal alloys that exhibited memory properties? Were there any experimental programs working with materials that changed their molecular structure in response to physical stress? The answers he received were consistent. Nothing like what he had described was possible using known technology. The materials he had examined were at least decades ahead of anything being developed in terrestrial laboratories. This conclusion should have excited Marcel. As an intelligence officer, he was trained to identify technological threats and opportunities. If a foreign power had developed such advanced materials, it represented a significant national security concern. If the materials were of domestic origin, they suggested American science had achieved remarkable breakthroughs. But Marcel suspected neither explanation was correct. The debris patterns, the crash site characteristics, and most importantly, the witnesses who claimed to have seen the actual craft before its recovery, all pointed to a third possibility, one that challenged fundamental assumptions about humanity's place in the universe. As months passed, Marcel found himself increasingly isolated. His colleagues at the base seemed to have accepted the weather balloon explanation without question, or at least without public doubt. His superiors made it clear that the incident was closed and not open for discussion. But Marcel wasn't the only military officer wrestling with what he had witnessed. Captain Irving Newton, the weather officer who had been brought in to identify the debris as balloon materials, had his own doubts about the official story. Newton had been ordered to examine the debris and provide an identification that would support the weather balloon narrative. He had complied, but the experience left him uncomfortable. The materials shown to reporters and photographers were clearly balloon remnants, but they weren't the same materials that Marcel had initially collected from the crash site. Someone had switched the debris. The extraordinary materials that Marcel had gathered from Mac Brazel's ranch had been replaced with conventional balloon fragments for the press demonstration. It was a shell game, designed to support a predetermined conclusion rather than reveal the truth. Newton never spoke publicly about his suspicions, but he confided in close friends that the Roswell incident was far more complex than the official story suggested. Something significant had been recovered from that ranch, and powerful people had decided that the public didn't need to know what it was. By 1950, Marcel had been transferred to a new assignment in Washington, D.C. The move was presented as a promotion, recognition of his skills and dedication, but Marcel understood that it was also a way of removing him from the location where the incident had occurred. In Washington, Marcel threw himself into his new responsibilities. He worked on classified projects, analyzed intelligence reports, and served his country with the same dedication he had always shown. But the Roswell incident remained with him, a constant reminder of mysteries that defied official explanations. It was during his time in Washington that Marcel first encountered other military personnel who had witnessed similar events. Officers stationed at bases across the American Southwest shared stories of unusual aircraft, inexplicable radar contacts, and debris recoveries that didn't match any known technology. A pattern was emerging. Roswell wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a larger phenomenon that the military was working hard to keep secret. Advanced objects were operating in American airspace on a regular basis, and conventional explanations couldn't account for their capabilities. Marcel began to compile his own unofficial files on these incidents. He was careful to avoid classified information, focusing instead on witness testimonies and circumstantial evidence. But even this limited investigation revealed that something extraordinary was happening, something that challenged the basic assumptions of Cold War security planning. The implications were staggering. If these objects were of foreign origin, they represented a technological threat that made nuclear weapons seem primitive by comparison. If they were domestic products, then American science had achieved breakthroughs that were being kept secret even from military intelligence officers. But there was a third possibility, one that Marcel found himself considering more seriously as the evidence accumulated. What if these objects weren't of terrestrial origin at all? The idea would have seemed laughable to Marcel before Roswell. He was a rational man, trained in scientific methodology and logical analysis. But the materials he had examined at the crash site had forced him to expand his understanding of what was possible. If beings from other worlds were visiting Earth, it would explain everything. The advanced materials, the unconventional aircraft designs, the government secrecy. It would also explain why the truth was being so carefully guarded. The social and political implications of such a revelation would be profound. Marcel never reached a definitive conclusion about the nature of the phenomena he was investigating. But by the mid-1950s, he had become convinced that the official explanations were inadequate. Something was operating in Earth's skies that didn't match any known technology, and the government knew more about it than they were willing to admit. When Marcel retired from the military in 1963, he carried with him the weight of secrets that he could never fully share. The oath of secrecy he had taken as an intelligence officer bound him to silence on classified matters. But the debris he had examined at Roswell had never been officially classified. The materials themselves had been covered up, but his personal observations remained his own. For years, Marcel said nothing publicly about the incident. He returned to civilian life, worked various jobs, and tried to put the strange events of July 1947 behind him. But the memory of those impossible materials haunted him. In quiet moments, he would find himself remembering the way the metal had felt in his hands, the symbols that seemed to shift and change as he looked at them. It wasn't until the late 1970s that Marcel finally decided to speak. UFO researchers had begun investigating the Roswell incident, tracking down witnesses and trying to piece together what had really happened. When they found Marcel, they discovered a man who had been carrying a profound secret for more than 30 years. His first public statements were careful and measured. He acknowledged that the debris he had examined was unlike anything he had seen before or since. He described the unusual properties of the materials, the way they seemed to defy conventional physics. And he made it clear that the weather balloon explanation had never satisfied him. Marcel's decision to speak publicly changed everything. Here was a credible witness, a career military officer with impeccable credentials, confirming that something extraordinary had been recovered at Roswell. His testimony gave legitimacy to an incident that had been dismissed and ridiculed for decades. But Marcel's revelations also came at a personal cost. Former colleagues distanced themselves from him. Military officials criticized his decision to discuss classified events. He was accused of seeking attention, of betraying his oath of service. Marcel endured the criticism with quiet dignity. He had spent his life serving his country, and he believed that the truth served the national interest better than continued secrecy. The American people, he felt, deserved to know that their government had recovered materials that suggested humanity was not alone in the universe. In his final years, Marcel became something of a reluctant celebrity in UFO research circles. He appeared at conferences, gave interviews, and patiently answered the same questions over and over again. But he never wavered from his core testimony. The debris recovered at Roswell was not of terrestrial origin. When Jesse Marcel died in 1986, he took with him the most detailed first-hand knowledge of the physical evidence from Roswell. But his legacy lived on in the testimony he had provided, the careful descriptions of materials that challenged everything scientists thought they knew about physics and engineering. The desert wind that had carried him to that crash site in 1947 continued to blow across the New Mexico landscape, stirring the sagebrush and tumbleweeds, carrying with it the whispers of a secret that refused to stay buried. Under the vast canopy of stars that Marcel had stared at for so many years, the mystery endured. Somewhere in classified storage facilities, the real debris might still exist, waiting for a time when humanity would be ready to accept the truth about what fell from the sky that summer night in Roswell. Chapter 6. The Families Who Paid the Price. The morning sun cast long shadows across the New Mexico desert as life in Roswell slowly returned to what most people considered normal. The headlines about flying saucers had faded from the newspapers. The weather balloon explanation had been accepted by the national media, but for the families who had been directly involved in the incident, normalcy would prove to be an elusive thing. Mac Brazel returned to his ranch after his days of questioning by the military, but he was not the same man who had driven into town with a truck full of strange debris. His neighbors noticed the change immediately. Brazel had always been talkative, the kind of person who would chat for hours about weather and cattle prices and the small dramas of rural life. Now he was withdrawn, almost secretive. When friends asked about his experience with the military, he would change the subject or make excuses to leave. The man who had discovered what might have been the most significant find in human history seemed to want nothing more than to forget it had ever happened. But forgetting wasn't easy. Brazel's ranch hand, Tommy Tyree, had been with him when they first encountered the debris field. Tyree remembered the wonder in Brazel's voice as he described the unusual materials, the way the rancher's eyes had lit up with curiosity and excitement. After his return from military questioning, that excitement was gone. Brazel seemed almost afraid of the land where he had made his discovery. He avoided the area where the debris had been found, routing his cattle drives around it even when it meant taking longer, more difficult paths. Tommy Tyree tried to talk to his boss about what had happened, but Brazel would only say that they had all been mistaken about what they had found. It was just balloon material, he would insist. nothing more than trash left behind by some military experiment. But Tyree had handled the debris himself. He knew it was unlike anything he had ever encountered. The official story satisfied no one who had actually witnessed the materials firsthand. But it became increasingly clear that questioning that story came with consequences. Mac Brazel's daughter, Bessie Brazel Schreiber, was living in Albuquerque when the incident occurred, but she visited her father regularly. In the months following the recovery, she noticed that he had more money than usual. New furniture appeared in his modest ranch house. He bought equipment for the ranch that he had been talking about purchasing for years, but had never been able to afford. When Bessie asked her father about his improved financial situation, he was evasive. He would only say that some people had been generous in recognition of his cooperation with the authorities. It wasn't difficult to read between the lines. McBrazel had been compensated for his silence, but money couldn't erase memory. In private moments with his family, usually late at night when the desert was quiet and still, Brazel would sometimes let his guard down. He would talk about the materials he had found, describing their impossible properties with the same wonder that had initially captured his imagination. The metal that couldn't be cut or burned, the beams with their strange symbols, the foil that remembered its shape. These weren't the remnants of any weather balloon, and everyone in the family knew it. Sheriff George Wilcox faced his own pressures in the aftermath of the incident. As the law enforcement officer who had initially contacted the military about Brazel's discovery, Wilcox found himself caught between his duty to the public and demands for secrecy from federal authorities. Wilcox's granddaughter, Barbara Duggar, would later recall how the sheriff's personality changed after the Roswell incident. Her grandfather had always been outgoing and confident, comfortable with his role as a public servant in a small community. But after July 1947, he became cautious and secretive. Federal agents visited the sheriff's office repeatedly in the weeks following the recovery. They made it clear that the incident was a matter of national security and that any unauthorized disclosure of information would be treated as a serious crime. Wilcox, a patriotic man who had served his country during World War I, took these warnings seriously. But the warnings came with an implicit threat that extended beyond legal consequences. Wilcox was told that his continued effectiveness as sheriff depended on his complete cooperation with federal authorities. In a small town like Roswell, where the sheriff was an elected official dependent on public support, such pressure was particularly effective. The stress of maintaining secrecy while dealing with constant inquiries from reporters and curious citizens took its toll on Wilcox's health. Family members noticed that he seemed perpetually worried, always looking over his shoulder as if he expected to be watched. When Wilcox died in 1963, he took most of his secrets to the grave, but on his deathbed, he finally spoke openly to his granddaughter about what he had witnessed. The debris that Mac Brazel had brought to his office was unlike anything terrestrial, he told her, and the federal response to its recovery had been swift, comprehensive, and frightening in its implications. The families of military personnel who had been involved in the recovery operation faced their own unique challenges. Major Jesse Marcel's wife and children found themselves subject to subtle but persistent surveillance in the months following the incident. Phone calls would be monitored. Mail would arrive already opened, then resealed with obvious carelessness. Neighbors would mention seeing unfamiliar cars parked on their street, occupied by men in suits who seemed to be watching the Marcel house. Jesse Marcel Jr. was 11 years old when his father brought home pieces of the mysterious debris. The boy had handled the materials himself, marveling at their unusual properties. But within days of that experience, he was approached by men who identified themselves as government officials. These men explained to young Jesse that what he had seen was classified military equipment. They made it clear that discussing the incident with anyone, including his friends and teachers, would constitute a violation of national security. For an 11-year-old boy, the implications were both confusing and terrifying. The pressure on military families was particularly intense because their livelihoods depended on their continued good standing with the armed forces. Any suggestion of unreliability or inability to maintain security could end a career and destroy a family's financial stability. But perhaps the most tragic cases were those of military personnel who had witnessed the incident and found themselves unable to reconcile what they had seen with the official explanations they were required to support. Staff Sergeant Irving Newton, the weather officer who had been brought in to identify the debris as balloon materials for the press, struggled with his role in what he knew to be a cover-up. Newton was a man of integrity who took his professional responsibilities seriously. Being asked to misrepresent evidence went against everything he believed in as both a scientist and a soldier. But Newton also understood that his military career and his family's security depended on his cooperation with superior officers. The internal conflict took its toll. Newton began drinking more heavily, and his family noticed that he seemed perpetually anxious and distracted. He would sometimes wake up in the middle of the night, muttering about things that didn't make sense to his wife. Years later, when researchers tracking down Roswell witnesses contacted Newton, they found a man who had been carrying a heavy burden of guilt and confusion for decades. He had participated in what he knew to be a deliberate deception, but he had never understood why such extreme measures had been necessary. The pattern was consistent across all the families who had been touched by the Roswell incident. Financial compensation, career advancement, and subtle threats combined to ensure silence. But the psychological cost of maintaining that silence was enormous. Children grew up knowing that their parents were keeping profound secrets. Spouses found themselves excluded from significant aspects of their partner's experiences. Extended families were divided by knowledge that couldn't be shared. The desert that had given up its secrets in July 1947 continued to hold many more. In ranch houses and suburban homes, in bars and churches, the people who had witnessed something extraordinary learned to live with the weight of untellable truths. They passed down their stories in whispers, fragments of memory shared in moments of trust and intimacy. Some took their secrets to the grave, but others found ways to preserve them for future generations who might be more ready to hear the truth. Under the endless New Mexico sky, the stars continued their ancient dance, indifferent to the human struggles playing out beneath them. But for those who had glimpsed evidence of intelligence among those stars, the universe would never look quite the same again. The families who paid the price for that glimpse carried forward a legacy of wonder and burden, hope and fear. They had seen the future arrive ahead of schedule, and they had learned that not all truths are welcome in their time. Chapter 7. The Cover-Up Machine. In the weeks following the Roswell incident, a remarkable transformation took place within the corridors of military intelligence. What had begun as a routine recovery operation for unusual debris quickly evolved into one of the most sophisticated information management campaigns in American history. The decision to suppress the true nature of the Roswell recovery didn't happen by accident. It was the result of careful deliberation by officials who understood that the implications of the discovery extended far beyond military security concerns. General Hoyt Vandenberg, Chief of Staff of the newly independent Air Force, found himself at the center of these discussions. Vandenberg was a pragmatic leader who had navigated the complexities of military politics during World War II and the early Cold War. But the briefings he received about Roswell presented challenges unlike any he had previously encountered. The materials recovered from the crash site defied easy explanation. Military scientists who examined them could offer no conventional interpretation for their properties. The metal alloys exhibited characteristics that were decades ahead of known metallurgy. The electronic components, what few could be identified, operated on principles that weren't fully understood by American engineers. More disturbing were the biological specimens that had allegedly been recovered. Medical personnel who examined them reported anatomical structures that bore no resemblance to any terrestrial life forms. The beings were humanoid in basic configuration, but their internal organs, skeletal structure, and neural systems were completely alien. Vandenberg faced an unprecedented decision. The discovery could represent the greatest scientific breakthrough in human history. But it could also trigger social and political upheaval that might threaten the stability of American society. In the summer of 1947, the United States was still adjusting to its new role as a global superpower. The Cold War was intensifying, with the Soviet Union emerging as an existential threat to American security. Domestically, the country was experiencing rapid social and economic changes as millions of veterans returned from overseas service. The revelation that Earth was being visited by beings from other worlds would complicate all of these existing challenges. Religious institutions would struggle to incorporate alien life into their theological frameworks. Scientific establishments would face fundamental questions about humanity's understanding of physics and biology. Political leaders would confront issues of planetary defense and interstellar diplomacy for which no precedent existed. Vandenberg consulted with advisors across multiple disciplines. Psychologists warned about the potential for mass panic and social disruption. Military strategists worried about the implications of contact with a technologically superior civilization. Intelligence officers pointed out that public disclosure would alert potential enemies to American knowledge of advanced technologies. The consensus was clear. The truth about Roswell was too dangerous to reveal, at least for now. But suppressing the truth required more than simply denying that anything unusual had happened. It required the creation of alternative narratives that could withstand scrutiny, the management of witnesses who might contradict official stories, and the establishment of long-term security protocols to prevent future leaks. The weather balloon explanation was chosen because it provided a plausible framework for dismissing unusual debris while maintaining the cover of classified military operations. Project Mogul, the high-altitude surveillance program designed to monitor Soviet nuclear tests, offered perfect justification for secrecy. If pressed, officials could claim that national security required them to conceal details about balloon-based intelligence gathering, but the cover story was just the beginning. A comprehensive program was implemented to ensure that witnesses would remain silent and that physical evidence would disappear into classified storage facilities where it could be studied without public scrutiny. Major Jesse Marcel found himself at the center of this effort. His original statements to the press had been too specific and too credible to simply ignore. Marcel was a respected intelligence officer with an impeccable reputation. His initial descriptions of the debris carried weight that couldn't be dismissed easily. The solution was to discredit Marcel's judgment while maintaining his overall credibility as a military officer. Marcel was portrayed as someone who had been temporarily confused by unusual but ultimately conventional debris. His expertise in aircraft identification was acknowledged, but his unfamiliarity with experimental balloon equipment was emphasized. Marcel understood what was happening, but he also understood his position within the military hierarchy. His career depended on his cooperation with superior officers. His family's security was tied to his continued service. He played the role assigned to him. But privately, he never wavered from his original assessment of the debris. Mac Brazel presented a different kind of challenge. As a civilian, he couldn't be controlled through military discipline, but he could be influenced through other means. Brazel was reportedly offered financial compensation in exchange for his cooperation with the official narrative. His ranch was remote and economically marginal. The money would make a significant difference in his quality of life. More importantly, Brazel was made to understand that his continued prosperity depended on his discretion. Government contracts for ranch products could be awarded or withdrawn. Access to federal land for grazing could be granted or denied. In a region where many ranchers depended on government cooperation for their survival, such leverage was extremely effective. The other witnesses were handled according to their individual circumstances. Military personnel were bound by security oaths and military justice. Civilian employees were required to sign non-disclosure agreements. Local residents were visited by federal agents who explained the national security implications of the incident. But suppression was only one aspect of the operation. Equally important was the active promotion of alternative explanations that would satisfy public curiosity while directing attention away from the truth. The weather balloon narrative was disseminated through carefully orchestrated press briefings. Photographs of conventional balloon debris were distributed to news organizations. Experts were made available to explain the various components of high-altitude surveillance equipment. The campaign was remarkably successful. Within days, the initial excitement about flying saucer recoveries had been replaced by mundane stories about military weather research. The national media accepted the official explanation and moved on to other topics. But the cover-up operation extended far beyond simple media management. A broader program was established to monitor and respond to future incidents involving unidentified flying objects. The goal was to ensure that Roswell-type situations could be contained before they attracted public attention. This program involved multiple federal agencies. The Air Force took primary responsibility for investigating aerial phenomena and managing public information about unusual incidents. The CIA provided intelligence support and coordinated with international allies who might encounter similar situations. The FBI monitored domestic groups that showed interest in UFO-related topics. Academic institutions were also brought into the effort. Research programs were established to study unusual phenomena using scientific methodologies that would either explain away anomalous events or classify significant discoveries. Scientists who showed too much interest in UFO-related topics found their funding reduced or their security clearances revoked. The comprehensive nature of the cover-up operation reflected the seriousness with which officials viewed the Roswell incident. This wasn't a casual decision to suppress embarrassing information. It was a systematic effort to protect what they saw as vital national interests. But secrets this significant have a way of persisting despite the best efforts to suppress them. Witnesses remembered what they had seen. Physical evidence was hidden but not destroyed. Documents were classified but not eliminated. Over the decades that followed, pieces of the truth would begin to surface. Deathbed confessions would reveal details that had been hidden for years. Freedom of Information Act requests would uncover documents that contradicted official narratives. Researchers would track down witnesses and compile testimonies that painted a picture far more complex than the weather balloon story. The cover-up machine that had been so effective in 1947 would find itself increasingly challenged by persistent investigators who refused to accept official explanations. The truth about Roswell would prove to be remarkably resilient, surviving decades of suppression and emerging stronger with each passing year. Under the vast New Mexico sky, where the stars had witnessed the events of that summer night in 1947, the desert continued to hold its secrets. But some secrets, no matter how carefully guarded, have a way of finding the light. The wind that blew across the crash site carried with it whispers of a truth that powerful people had tried to bury. But truth, like the desert itself, is patient and enduring. It waits for its moment, confident that eventually all hidden things must be revealed. Chapter 8. The Truth That Won't Stay Buried. Decades have passed since that summer night in 1947 when something fell from the stars into the New Mexico desert. The official story remains unchanged. Weather balloon debris, military equipment, nothing more than the remnants of classified surveillance technology. But time has a way of eroding even the most carefully constructed cover-ups. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the desert air is still and cool, you can almost hear the whispers of those who were there. The voices of witnesses who carried their secrets to the grave, and others who finally found the courage to speak. Their testimonies weave together like threads in a tapestry, creating a picture that grows clearer and more compelling with each passing year. Major Jesse Marcel broke his silence in the late 1970s, 3 decades after he first handled that impossible debris. His decision to speak publicly opened floodgates that had been sealed for a generation. Marcel's testimony wasn't the ramblings of an attention seeker or conspiracy theorist. This was a career military officer, a man who had served his country with distinction, finally telling the world what he had witnessed. The materials were not of this world, Marcel said. They exhibited properties that defied every known principle of earthly engineering. The metal was lighter than aluminum, but stronger than steel. It could not be cut, burned, or permanently deformed. The symbols along the beam-like structures were unlike any human language, flowing and organic in their design. Marcel's revelations inspired others to come forward. One by one, the surviving witnesses began to share their stories. Each account was different in its details, but they all pointed toward the same conclusion. Something extraordinary had crashed in the desert near Roswell, and the government had worked tirelessly to keep the truth hidden. Glenn Dennis, the mortician who had received those strange phone calls about child-sized coffins, eventually told his story to researchers. The calls had come from the base hospital, he insisted, and the questions had been specific and urgent. Someone at Roswell Army Airfield had needed information about handling small bodies that had been damaged by exposure. Barbara Duggar shared her grandfather, Sheriff Wilcox's deathbed confession. The old lawman had finally admitted that the debris Mac Brazel brought to his office was unlike anything terrestrial. The government response had been swift and intimidating, making it clear that silence was not optional, but mandatory. Dr. Jesse Marcel Jr., who had been just 11 years old when his father brought home pieces of the debris, grew up to become a respected physician. His childhood memories of handling the strange materials remained vivid and detailed. The metal fragments had felt warm to the touch, almost alive. The symbols seemed to shift and change when viewed from different angles. As more witnesses came forward, researchers began to piece together a more complete picture of what had happened in July 1947. The crash site had been larger than initially reported, extending across multiple locations. The debris field that Mac Brazel discovered was only one part of a larger pattern of wreckage scattered across the desert. More significantly, witnesses began to describe other recoveries that had taken place simultaneously. While public attention focused on the ranch where Brazel found the debris, military teams were apparently working at additional sites where larger sections of the craft had come to rest. These secondary sites were where the most sensitive materials were recovered. According to witness testimony, intact sections of the craft were found, along with the bodies of its occupants. The beings were described consistently across multiple witness accounts: small humanoid figures with large heads and eyes, dressed in form-fitting metallic suits. The recovery operation had been massive and coordinated. Hundreds of military personnel were involved, from enlisted men who cordoned off crash sites to high-ranking officers who supervised the packaging and transport of materials. But each participant had been given only a small piece of the overall picture, making it difficult for anyone to fully understand the scope of what had been discovered. This compartmentalization was deliberate, part of a security protocol designed to prevent leaks and maintain deniability. But it also meant that the truth could only be reconstructed by finding witnesses who had participated in different aspects of the operation and convincing them to share their pieces of the puzzle. The process took decades. Many witnesses died before researchers could locate them. Others refused to speak, even years after their retirement from military service. The oath of secrecy they had sworn was a powerful bond, strengthened by years of habit and reinforced by ongoing concerns about personal and professional consequences. But gradually, the picture became clearer. Government documents obtained through Freedom of Information Act requests revealed that far more officials had been involved in the Roswell incident than had been publicly acknowledged. Military personnel from multiple bases had been reassigned to New Mexico in the days following the crash. Transport aircraft had carried classified cargo from Roswell to facilities in Ohio and other locations. Most tellingly, the weather balloon explanation began to show serious inconsistencies when subjected to detailed analysis. The debris described by witnesses bore no resemblance to the materials used in high-altitude surveillance balloons. The recovery operation had been far more extensive than would have been warranted for balloon wreckage. The security measures implemented were disproportionate to the supposed importance of the materials involved. Scientific analysis of the witness testimonies revealed another intriguing pattern. The properties attributed to the debris by multiple independent sources were remarkably consistent. Different witnesses, interviewed decades apart and in different locations, described identical characteristics: memory metal that returned to its original shape, symbols that seemed to shift and change, materials that were simultaneously incredibly light and impossibly strong. These consistent descriptions suggested either a massive coordinated conspiracy among the witnesses or the reality of materials that exhibited truly anomalous properties. Given the backgrounds of the witnesses, many of whom had nothing to gain and much to lose by coming forward, conspiracy seemed less likely than truth-telling. Modern materials science has made some of the witness descriptions seem less fantastical than they did in 1947. Shape memory alloys, fiber optics, and advanced composites have become common in aerospace applications. But even today's most advanced materials don't exhibit all the properties described by Roswell witnesses. The symbols reported on the beam-like structures remain particularly puzzling. Multiple witnesses described markings that looked almost like hieroglyphics but weren't quite like any earthly writing system. The symbols appeared to be integral to the material itself rather than etched or painted on the surface. They seemed to have a three-dimensional quality, appearing raised when viewed from one angle and recessed when viewed from another. Contemporary researchers have attempted to recreate these symbols based on witness descriptions, but the results have been disappointing. Whatever technology was used to create the original markings was apparently more sophisticated than anything available to terrestrial engineers. Perhaps most significantly, the Roswell incident wasn't an isolated event. Research has revealed that similar crashes and recoveries took place at other locations during the same time period. Military personnel who served at different bases have come forward with accounts of debris recoveries and alien body retrievals that echo the Roswell testimonies. The pattern suggests that the summer of 1947 marked a period of unusual activity in Earth's skies. Multiple craft apparently experienced difficulties, leading to crashes and recoveries across the American Southwest. The government response was coordinated and comprehensive, indicating that officials had contingency plans for dealing with such situations. This broader context gives the Roswell incident additional significance. It wasn't just a single anomalous event that officials scrambled to explain away. It was part of a larger phenomenon that required systematic responses and long-term security measures. Today, as we drift gently through this story under the endless canopy of stars, the truth about Roswell seems both more elusive and more certain than ever. The official weather balloon explanation has been thoroughly discredited by decades of research and testimony, but the full truth remains tantalizingly out of reach, protected by layers of classification and secrecy that may never be completely penetrated. What we can say with confidence is that something extraordinary happened in the New Mexico desert in July 1947. The witnesses were credible people with nothing to gain from fabricating their accounts. The materials they described exhibited properties that challenge our understanding of physics and engineering. The government response was far more extensive and secretive than would have been warranted by the recovery of conventional debris. The desert where it all began continues to hold its secrets, but some truths are stronger than any effort to suppress them. Under the vast New Mexico sky, where the stars shine with ancient light and infinite possibility, the story of Roswell endures as a reminder that our universe is far stranger and more wonderful than we ever dared to imagine. The wind that whispers through the sagebrush carries with it the voices of those who witnessed something that changed their understanding of reality. Their testimonies form a bridge between our mundane world and possibilities that stretch beyond the furthest star. And in the quiet moments before sleep, when the boundaries between dream and waking blur, we can almost hear the truth calling to us across the decades. Patient and persistent, waiting for a time when humanity will be ready to accept what fell from the sky that summer night in Roswell. The evidence they tried to bury refuses to stay hidden. Like light from distant stars, it continues to reach us across the darkness, carrying with it the promise that we are not alone in this vast and mysterious universe.